This video is sponsored by Atlanta Motor Speedway. To find out how you can get an exclusive deal on tickets for the next great Atlanta race, stay tuned until the end of the video and check out the description down below.
But today, the king of stock car racing, Richard Petty, will end his illustrious career. And as you look at the rest of the starting lineup, note that Jeff Gordon, who will be making his first Winston Cup start here today, will go from inside row number 11.
And Jeff Gordon has been one of the fastest cars in practice.
3 years here, he has earned more points.
Oh, look out.
Davey Allison is in the crash bomb.
Oh, Ernie Irvin, and it's all over for Davey Allison.
No, it's not over yet.
Kulwicki is coming off of corner number 4, knowing that he's winning the championship. There's the checkered flag for Allen. He's the champion for 92.
There's a running joke on this channel that no matter the topic, it always comes back to the 1992 Hooters 500 at Atlanta Motor Speedway. And you know what? There's a lot of truth said in jest. There's so many storylines that begin or end here that any comprehensive history of NASCAR has to include at least a mention of this race. It was where one legend would end his journey and where another would begin his own, amidst the backdrop of NASCAR's craziest championship battle. A 6-way fight between NASCAR's most popular driver, the sport's most beloved underdog, two sons of NASCAR royalty, the oldest winner in NASCAR history, and a journeyman who would soon turn into a legend himself, who has had to fight and claw for everything he's gotten up to this point. The 1992 Hooters 500 was more than just a great race. It was a true honest-to-God passing of the torch moment. Never again would so many greats occupy the same asphalt for a single race ever again. And for two of the men in this race, it would be their last season finale before their untimely and tragic deaths just a few months into the future. Even at the time, everyone at Atlanta Motor Speedway on that sunny afternoon in November knew this was going to be a special moment. But not even in their wildest dreams did anyone there believe it would end up being as iconic as it was. There's a lot to cover here, so why don't we start with the 6 men who are in contention for the championship today. Back then, the champion was decided by whoever had the most points at the end of the year. The better you finished, the more points you got. And that was about it. There weren't any playoffs, eliminations, or cutoffs back then. Every race from first to last counted toward your total, save for the Bud Shootout at the beginning of the year and the All-Star race. Even still, 6 drivers are within 113 points of one another at the start of the last race of the season. Pretty astonishing when you consider that the maximum number of points you could score in a race was 185. 3 of the 6 guys in this championship slugfest are long shots, but they're still mathematically in it. Harry Gant, Kyle Petty, and Mark Martin have all had pretty good years thus far. But thanks to the inconsistency of the top 3, they roll into Atlanta with a shot at taking home the Winston Cup this year. The bottom 3 have 2 wins apiece, but they've all taken different paths to get to this point. Let's start with the man furthest out, Mark Martin. An Arkansas native who burst onto the scene in the early 80s, Mark found success early on. In 1981, he started just 5 races and never qualified worse than 6th. In his 5th and final race that year, he'd finished 3rd, netting his first career top 5. The next year, he'd go full-time with a promising sponsorship deal, but his sponsor, Apache Stove, would end up never paying him a dime. He ran the full season anyway as an owner-driver, often out of his own pocket with no sponsor. He did this in hopes of claiming the Rookie of the Year award along with the prize money and a trip to the year-end banquet, but Jeff Bodine would edge him out. Now in serious debt and struggling to live out his dreams of being a full-time race car driver, Mark Martin took any seat he could get. He describes his 1982 and 83 struggles as being the most difficult years of his life, often finding it difficult to just get out of bed in the morning. He did well enough in his limited equipment that a Ford loyalist by the name of Jack Roush took notice and hired him to drive his flagship car, the now iconic number 6. In 1989, he'd score his first win, and the following year he'd put together a stellar season with an average finish of a mind-boggling 5.4. But due to a questionable tech inspection penalty at Rockingham that docked him 46 points, he'd lose the championship to Dale Earnhardt by just 26 points. In 1991 he would struggle, but in 1992 he'd bounce back and score his 2 wins at Martinsville and at Charlotte. Rolling into Atlanta, if a miracle is to occur, Mark is a fairly good candidate. He won the pole for the spring race earlier this year and starts 4th today. He's good at the mile-and-a-halfs, and his last win in the fall race at Charlotte has put him within striking distance of the championship, just 113 points out. And the only reason why he's in contention at all here today was because during his Charlotte win, the points leader at the time, Bill Elliott, broke a rear track bar mount, and Mark bit into his lead significantly. The most points you could score in a single race was 185, and 10 of those came from bonus points. 5 for leading a lap, and 5 more if you led the most laps. The minimum number of points you could score if you finished 43rd out of 43 starters was 34 points, but the final race in Atlanta has 41 starters, so that minimum points number becomes 40. Mark basically needs for everyone ahead of him to crash out early, but as crazy as this season has been, that's not entirely out of the question. He'll run as hard as he can and shoot for the win, and let the chips fall where they may. That gets us to 5th in line for the championship, Kyle Petty, 1 point behind Harry Gant in 4th. and 98 points back of our points leader, Davey Allison. He's a long way out too, but he's in a much more favorable position than Mark. He merely needs the top 3 to wreck out and finish one position ahead of Harry Gant to win it all. The son of the sport's greatest driver of all time, Richard Petty, Kyle has had to live in his father's shadow since day one, constantly being compared to him. With little to no success under the Petty Enterprises banner, he left for the Wood Brothers team in the 80s, scored his first victory, and then joined up with an upstart team in Felix Sabates Racing. And he's been lighting up the charts ever since. He has a slew of W's to his name now, and he's within striking distance of the top 3 should something happen today. Speaking of Kyle Petty's old man, it's Richard Petty's last race ever in the Cup Series today. At age 55, the greatest NASCAR driver of all time is going to hang it up and call it a career. The distinction of being the greatest of all time isn't at all a stretch for Richard Petty either. Winner of 200 races in NASCAR's top division, he almost doubles the win total of the runner-up, and his stats seem almost like the stuff of mythology. Where you would expect figures in the double digits, he has triple-digit numbers. Where you would be impressed by triple digits, he has quadruple digits. Any look at the NASCAR record books, however long or short, is going to include the name Richard Petty a staggering number of times. He has more than earned his nickname, the King. But the last decade has not been kind to Richard. The racing gods care little of what royal family you belong to. His 200th and final victory came in 1984, and he's been winless for 8 years. His finishes have left a lot to be desired, and earlier this year he led his final laps in the Pepsi 400 at Daytona. But through all the monotony of the late 80s and early 90s, what kept him showing up race after race? Well, according to him, he just thought it was tons of fun, and he'd keep racing until it was no longer fun anymore. But after a few horrendous accidents and DNFs due to fatigue, even he realized it was time to hang it up by the time 1991 came to a close. But just leaving the sport outright didn't sit well with him, and it wouldn't feel right leaving all the fans that had supported him throughout the years so suddenly. So he announced the 1992 Farewell Tour. At every race that year, he'd participate in special events and give every NASCAR fan the opportunity to meet with him and sign autographs while he was still a competitor. It was an absolute hit, and it was more than befitting of a king of NASCAR. While royalty will make its final laps here at the Atlanta Motor Speedway, we still have a champion to crown. Although age has caught up with Petty, it seems to have turned a blind eye to Harry Gant, who is having one of the best years of his career at age 52. He's got a couple of wins to his credit this season, and earlier this year he claimed a record that still stands to this day. The oldest driver to ever win a Cup race. At 52 years and 219 days old, handsome Harry Gant won the Champion Spark Plugs 400 at Michigan International Speedway, and inadvertently scored Oldsmobile's final Cup Series victory as well. What made his feat even more impressive was that he had already captured the oldest NASCAR winner title back in 1991 at Talladega, and then just kept adding to it. He later went into a tear in September of that year where he won every single race of that month, 4 in a row, earning him the nickname Mr. September. Of our 6-man championship hunt, Gant leads the rear 3, being just 97 points behind the leader and 1 point ahead of Kyle Petty. If any of the back 3 are to pull off a miracle here today, the seemingly ageless Harry Gant is a good choice. However, he's come down with the flu this weekend and is looking to get a replacement driver into the car as soon as he can. By rule, whoever starts the car gets credited with the finishing position, so his game plan is to start the race, turn a few laps, and as soon as they can get a replacement squared away, he'll hop out of the car. With the long shots out of the way, we can now get to the 3 men with a quote-unquote realistic shot at the championship. I say realistic in quotes because this season has been about as far removed from reality as one could imagine. The man sitting 3rd in the points, 40 behind our leader, is Bill Elliott. Far and away NASCAR's most popular driver, Bill has been a fan favorite since the early 80s, and has won just about everything there is to win twice over. You name it, Daytona 500s, Southern 500s, $1 million paychecks, he's got multiples of just about everything on his resume, except championships. He scored his first title in 1988 after a slew of incredible seasons that included all sorts of shattered records. At the conclusion of his less than stellar 1991 season, he would cut ties with his longtime partners over at Melling Racing, and would drive for Junior Johnson's flagship number 11 team. Junior Johnson was one of the greatest car owners of all time, so him netting the sport's most popular driver seemed like a match made in heaven, and early on it lived up to the hype. They didn't do so hot in the Daytona 500 opener, but then they won the next 4 races in a row and put everybody on notice. They'd have an extremely solid summer stretch where Bill would never finish outside the top 14 and gained the points lead despite never having won a race during that time span either. Even still, exiting the summer stretch, Bill added to his points lead to such an extent that people were all but preemptively starting to etch his name onto the Winston Cup trophy. The fact that he now sits 40 points out of the lead and 3rd going into the final race of the season would have seemed all but impossible in September. So what happened? Well, Bill's October run was an utter disaster, finishing 30th or worse in 3 of the last 5 races. his lone saving grace was a 4th place finish in the 3rd from last race at Rockingham. If he could have pulled off a decent finish in the penultimate race at Phoenix, he'd still maintain his points lead. But the brutal Arizona sun was just too much for his car to handle, and he had overheating issues all day. Junior Johnson was a notoriously tough car owner. He was livid with his team, and maybe the added pressure he put them under to perform in the closing weeks was causing them to crack. Nevertheless, Bill won the Spring Atlanta race earlier this year, and now all he has to do is win it again, lead the most laps, and hope Davey finishes 6th or worse. Sitting in 2nd place in the points is quite possibly the biggest long shot of all, Alan Kulwicki. Although he resides just 30 points behind Davey Allison, better than anybody else at the track today, his journey to this position is one of the most improbable things anyone could have ever imagined. If someone tells you they thought Alan Kulwicki was a championship contender at the start of the 1992 season, they're a liar. He was not only an outsider from Wisconsin, but a throwback to the way things used to be as well. He was an owner-driver and had complete autonomy over the team. In 1986, he drove for team owner Bill Terry before Terry would abruptly back out midway through the season. Allen pretty much sold everything he had except for his pickup truck and bought the team outright, running it almost as a one-man operation with just 2 full-time employees and a roster made up of volunteers and cast-offs from other race teams. He built up the team over time, and his best championship finish has been 8th up to this point, but usually he found himself barely hovering inside the top 15. He had just 3 wins in his entire career going into the 1992 season, and going into the 1991 season, he didn't even have a sponsor. But thanks to the title sponsor of this race, Hooters, that all changed. Hooters had sponsored a car that didn't qualify for the 1991 Atlanta Spring race, so they got in touch with Allen for a one-race deal as they wanted somebody to fly their colors at their hometown track. Allen won the pole for the race and finished a solid 8th. He and the owner of Hooters went out for dinner that night and signed a long-term contract on the back of a napkin, and the rest was history. Now funded through 1992, Allen got it in his head that he could make a run at the championship. He floated in the top 10 in points until week 6, when he seized an opportunity. The top 2 in points at the time, Bill Elliott and Davey Allison, both wreck out, and Allen straight up dominates the race, scoring the maximum allowable 185 points. He spends the rest of the year riffing off top 5s and top 10s, along with a second win at Pocono, where the points leaders would wreck out again. Exiting the summer stretch, he's kept the points leader at the time, Bill Elliott, within arm's reach. But at Dover, it seems like his championship hopes have gone up in smoke. He crashes out of the race and finishes 34th, while Bill and Davey finish 2nd and 4th respectively. Allen was ready to call it quits, but the team rallied around him, and the DNF galvanized the team and they came back with a vengeance, scoring 3 top 5s in the next 5 races, with no finish worse than 12th. That, combined with Bill Elliott's bad luck, put him at 2nd in the standings, poised to win an unthinkable championship. And if he does so, he will have overcome the biggest points deficit in the final 5 races in NASCAR history to make that happen. If the other 5 men in this hunt have had to endure hardships on their road to the Cup this year, then our points leader, Davey Allison, has had to go through hell on earth. He kicked off the season with a win at the Daytona 500, instantly nabbing the points lead. He would finish in the top 4 every race until Bristol, where he would wreck out. But he didn't just tear up a car, he cracked a few ribs in the process. He could barely get out of his junked car. Next week at North Wilkesboro, he'd put on an NFL-style flak jacket and win the race even as his legs began to cramp up. And the next week after that, he'd total another car at Martinsville and compound his cracked ribs with a bruised lung. He'd bounce right back again and win at Talladega. The man could just not be stopped. For the rest of the year, Davey would trade each win with some sort of horrific crash and injury to go with it. In the Pocono race that Allen won, Davey was spun out, got airborne, and flipped so violently that the G-forces burst open blood vessels in his eyes and mangled his right arm. Even still, he'd start the next race at Talladega 1 week out and get subbed out for Bobby Hillin after a fortunately timed rain caution. But all of that pales in comparison to what he had to go through at Michigan in August. There, his little brother, Clifford Allison, died in a practice crash for the preliminary 200-mile race. With a heavy heart, Davey strapped into his own car and willed it to a 5th-place finish. Late in the year, when Bill Elliott's car would overheat at Phoenix, Davey won the race and reclaimed the points lead for the first time since the summer stretch. And that sets the stage for the last race of the season. 6 paths filled with triumph, tragedy, beating the odds, and setting new records have given us this insane 6-way battle where anything could happen. And the sport's greatest driver of all time will put in his final laps. And all while this is happening, and seemingly unknown to anybody at the time, a young upstart from Indiana is making his very first start, Jeff Gordon. Having made his name on the dirt tracks of the Midwest driving sprint cars, it didn't take long for his talents to be sniffed out by NASCAR team owners. Bill Davis scooped him up first, and he blew up the second tier series this year by winning 11 poles, 10 top fives, and 3 wins. But when it came time to start pondering a move to the top division, Rick Hendrick made the move first. He expanded from a 2-car operation with his flagship number 5 piloted by Ricky Rudd and the number 25 piloted by Ken Schrader to a 3-car team with Jeff Gordon rolling out in the very first iteration of his now iconic Rainbow Warriors paint scheme sponsored by DuPont and the number 24. Nobody knows it yet here, but this will be as historical a moment as any other event in this race. Jeff Gordon will race full-time in 1993 and score his first wins in 1994. From there, he'll go on to win a total of 93 times, collect 4 championships, and 3 Daytona 500 crowns. He is easily one of the greatest NASCAR drivers of all time, and this is where it all started. A one-off race as an expansion team for Rick Hendrick, where for the first and only time, he will share the same asphalt as Richard Petty. It's a huge honor, and even today, the significance of that one race is not lost on him. And now we can finally get to the race itself. This will be a 328-lap, 500-mile race at the 1.54-mile Atlanta Motor Speedway, which has been the site of the series finale since 1987. With races in the early spring and late fall, Atlanta races are usually chilly affairs, with tires struggling to maintain grip on the 24-degree banks. Starting on the pole for this race is Rick Mast, and on his outside is Brett Bodine. Between them, they have just one win to their names, and since the possible champions may be playing it safe for points today, both of them see an opportunity to snag a win. However, on lap 2, everything goes to hell. At the conclusion of lap 1, Brett Bodine narrowly leads. But as Rick Mast battles back on the high side going into turn 1, the air on Bodine's rear spoiler is redirected by Mast's car running so close. That and a nudge by Dale Sr. from behind causes Bodine to go around and take Mast with him. The two careen into the wall and slide down the banks, right in front of all 6 championship-eligible drivers. Mark Martin, Harry Gant, and Kyle Petty make it through easily enough. But Bill Elliott and Alan Kulwicki have to do some in-car wizardry to make it through. Davey Allison, on the other hand, has a torn-up left rear quarter panel. So long as they can get the quarter panel flattened back out, they'll be fine. Otherwise, air would get sucked into the trunk cavity of the car and act like a parachute. Davey's crew, headed by Larry Mack and Joey Knuckles, get the car squared away and they begin their journey again. Atlanta is far from his best track. His average finish here in 12 attempts is 21.5. That's abysmal. He's hoping his 30-point cushion will help out, but now restarting way behind at one of Bill and Alan's best tracks, Davey and the 28 crew got their work cut out for them. On the restart, the lead changes hands between Dale Earnhardt, Ernie Irvan, and Jeff Bodine, as Bill and Alan run 5th and 6th respectively. Davey cuts his way through the field, but on lap 65 he gets a little help from an unlikely source. Michael Waltrip spins coming out of turn 2, and the top 3 in points come in for tires and fuel during the caution. Alan and Davey are pitted right next to each other, and the camera turns on them just in time to see Alan leave his pit stall and break first gear. The championship hopeful immediately throws his car into 4th and has his team push start the car. The same thing happened to him just a few races back at Charlotte, and they managed to finish 2nd there. Alan will just have to keep it in 4th gear for the rest of the day so the broken gear doesn't get moved around and potentially destroy the entire transmission. His pit exit times will suffer, but he's got a bad fast car and he can make up the time on the track. Despite his sluggish pit exit, Alan restarts in 2nd just behind Bill Elliott. On the restart, Alan and Bill run 1-2 for 20 laps and would swap the lead between them 5 times. They both know they have a shot to win the race and the title, and 5 bonus points for leading the most laps could make all the difference in winning the championship. Mark Martin catches up to them though and makes a daring 3-wide move to claim the lead. He'll hold on to it for the next 3 laps before a stalled car brings out another yellow. As the leaders come in for pit stops, Davey stays out, snags 5 points for leading a lap, and then comes back in to keep repairing his car. The race restarts, and after 6 laps of green flag racing on lap 96, a massive wreck on the front stretch in the back half of the field takes out half a dozen cars. None of the championship 6 are involved, but one man who is causes the entire crowd to gasp at the sight of his now flaming Pontiac, Richard Petty. The King, now in a car with no power, coasts down to the infield where he spots a fire truck and screeches to a halt in front of it. Probably most infamously, he says this on live TV.
Richard Petty, the car is on fire. Petty has got the car stopped.
Get in the fucking park.
It'll go out.
Fire extinguisher.
Hey, royalty are just normal people like you and me. I can't blame him, really. Petty had said in interviews all week that he had hoped to go out in a blaze of glory, and now, ironically, he's gone out in a literal blaze, which he laughs off in post-crash interviews. It's not an end befitting of one of NASCAR's greatest, though, so his team works overtime to get the car back into racing shape, so the King can finish the race out on the track instead of in the garage. But what of our young phenom Jeff Gordon? While he's struggling all day, he and his crew chief that he's brought over from his Busch Series venture, Ray Evernham, who actually used to work for Alan Kulwicki, liked for their cars to be extremely loose, so Gordon could use his natural talents to wheel the car around and make up time. But in the Busch Series, they ran a much lower horsepower V6 engine at the time, and the 600 plus horsepower V8s in the Winston Cup Series do not like to be subjected to loose chassis setups. Gordon brushes up against the wall several times during the day and runs outside of the top 25, but he will nevertheless make his mark on history today. Around the halfway point, Gordon comes in for repairs and his team leaves a roll of duct tape on the deck lid of the car. Gordon takes off and the tape rolls out onto the track, just in time for Davey Allison to hit it. It tears up the front of his car bad enough that it completely kills his aerodynamics, and he has to make yet another succession of repairs to fix it. Thankfully, a spin by Dale Earnhardt gives his team the time they need to fix everything up. He'll settle in around 5th position, right where he needs to be to clinch the championship. Alan and Bill march up to the front and Bill passes Ernie Irvan for the lead just after the halfway point and starts logging laps, hoping to secure the bonus for most laps led. But Alan isn't letting him get away. On lap 210, after the scheduled 328 lap distance, Alan passes Bill and will go on to lead the next 101 laps in a row. Alan isn't just racing Bill this hard because they're separated by 10 points, but also because for him, this is personal. He'd been picked by Junior Johnson to pilot the number 11 car on 2 separate occasions and was offered up 7-figure contracts, but Alan declined both times, stating that he had to do things his way and march to the beat of his own drum or else he would be miserable. Junior didn't take the rejection well, and when Alan was courting Maxwell House Coffee as his primary sponsor for 1991, Junior swooped in and stole the sponsor right out from underneath him for his second team, the 22. Bill and Alan ran nose to tail for an insane amount of time. Of the 20 lead changes today, they will account for half of those. I watched the entire race and I tried to count the number of laps in which they ran in successive positions. Maybe they ran 1 and 2 or 5th and 6th, but as long as there was no other car for position between them, I counted it. Now it's impossible to know for sure, as there wasn't a ticker for this race displaying running positions, as electronic timing and scoring hadn't been introduced yet, and the camera wasn't always focusing on them, but I can estimate. And by my estimation, Bill and Alan ran in back-to-back positions for at least 160 laps of the 328 lap race. They spent nearly half the race with the other guy either in their windshield or in their rearview mirror, never letting them get away. They raced 1-2 for a considerable part of the race as well. By my best guess, they did this for at least 100 laps. 2 men spent nearly a third of the race running 1-2 chasing the other down. They're fighting for just a handful of bonus points as they need all the help they can get, but Davey settled into the clinch spot. It shouldn't matter, but the two of them kept at it regardless, giving and asking no quarter of the other. It was almost like they knew what was about to happen next.
Best time to do it.
But for the last 3 years here, he has earned more points.
Oh, look crash! Davey Allison is in the crash, Bob.
Oh, Ernie Irvan, and it's all over for Davey Allison.
No, it's not over yet.
On lap 254, Davey Allison's championship quest comes to a close. He tries to pull away from the wall, but his steering is locked to the left. He begrudgingly takes off his steering wheel and gets out of the car and waves to the fans. All of the heartbreak, agony, and injuries will have to be all for naught this year. Fate can seem so cruel in the moment, but in time it would end up making a lot more sense. Davey had won the Daytona 500, the biggest race of the year, and now the championship of the series was out there for the taking for Alan Kulwicki. Both men would not live long enough to see the 1993 season come to a close, as both would lose their lives in aircraft accidents just 100 days or so apart. It would be a crushing blow to the sport, but it gave some added weight and meaning to the pitched back-and-forth championship battle of 1992, and showed that fate can be as fitting and fair as it is sudden and cruel. Even still, Davey's crew run over to the garage and try repairing the car. Mark Martin has blown an engine. Despite being sick with the flu, Harry Gant is still out there but runs outside the top 10, and Kyle Petty, who has had to battle back from a miscue, is just outside of the top 15. If Bill and Alan wreck each other out there while battling for the lead, and Davey can log just a few dozen laps, he might win the cup after all, but his chances are slim. The championship leader has now become the long shot himself. The race restarts and the last 70 laps would end up being run under green, just long enough to require everyone to have to come in and make a green flag pit for fuel. Alan leads a good chunk of laps, but in time, Bill jumps out to the lead, and Alan files in behind him. Alan still has that gear issue, and his pit exit times are still garbage. He'll have to make that time up somewhere, though, so his game plan is to just keep pace with Bill and put some distance between himself and third. It works, and he comes in late just for a quick splash-and-go fuel stop. He's so far ahead of third that he shouldn't even lose a spot during the pit stop. Fuelman Tony Gibson hooks up the fuel can to the car, and everyone lines up along the back bumper to push Allen away. They get just shy of 3.5 seconds worth of fuel into the car and send Allen away. The crew chief of the team, Paul Andrews, thinks they might be a bit short. Some of his crew members claim that they weighed the can to see if they had gotten the right amount of fuel into the car, but Andrews claims he didn't ask for it to be weighed and didn't want to know. He would just let fate decide. He does tell Allen, though, to be cautious and conserve as much as he can while running in second. Allen has led 103 laps thus far, but hasn't mathematically clinched the bonus for most laps led. Bill has an opportunity to lead 103 laps as well if he can lead every lap from here on out, in which case both drivers will get the 5 bonus points. Allen was 10 points ahead of Bill going into this race, so if they both get the points, Allen would have to finish second or better to clinch. However, Bill Elliott's crew chief, Tim Brewer, makes a colossal mistake. He loses track of the 94 car driven by Terry Labonte, who was just behind Allen and Bill. When he radios for Bill to come in for fuel, Labonte passes Bill during the pit stop and will lead just 1 lap before Bill gets out of the pits and back up to speed. Bill will lead every lap from here on out for a total of 102 laps led to Allen's 103. Allen clinches his bonus and has a little bit more breathing room. Bill Elliott's car owner, Junior Johnson, was so livid with Brewer that he fires him on the spot at the conclusion of the race. But as it would turn out, Allen wouldn't need that breathing room. Bill comes out of turn 4 on the last lap and wins the race in a bittersweet moment where he sees his second cup slip right through his fingers. And Allen, the outsider underdog from Wisconsin, finishes second, 10 points ahead of Bill, giving him the championship. His crew jumps from the wall and celebrates like they just won the Daytona 500, and they should. Allen has just 5 victories to his credit in his entire career, a teammate of misfits who didn't fit in with other teams, and now he has a championship along with the $1 million check that comes with it. As Allen does his now iconic Polish victory lap and waves to the fans, Bill quietly pulls into victory lane. Davey finishes in 27th, still running, in a car that is so beat up that it perfectly encapsulates his grueling 92 season. And the king, Richard Petty, takes his last lap around the track. Fans swarm the fence to get one last glimpse of the sport's most dominating driver in his final performance. The King finished 35th, and Jeff Gordon didn't fare much better, finishing in 31st. A humble beginning for a driver who would go on to dominate the 90s, shatter a litany of records, and win 3 titles before the decade was out. Allen rolls into the infield, in the spot reserved for the champ, and in true Kulwicki fashion, he doesn't exit the car immediately. Instead, he takes off his helmet and combs his hair with a comb he had stashed away inside the car. He hadn't locked down all of his sponsors for the 1993 season, and wanted to look good for anybody thinking about sponsoring him. Even right then and there, knowing how monumental of an achievement this was, he was still thinking about the future. He was the first owner-driver to win a title since Richard Petty did it in 1979. And the first college grad and driver born north of the Mason-Dixon line to win it as well. This championship hunt would go down in history as the sport's best, and it was a wild and fun race too. For the first and only time, Mark Martin, Dale Earnhardt, Richard Petty, Alan Kulwicki, Davey Allison, Bill Elliott, and Jeff Gordon would all share the same track for a points-paying race. It was a monumental passing of the torch moment that would carry the sport through the 90s and be an amazing, unintentional send-off for 2 of the sport's biggest personalities who we would lose just a few months later. Even at the time, people knew they had witnessed something great. They knew that this was the greatest championship battle in NASCAR history, and as time went on, it would only seem more special and memorable. I'm Slapshoes. Thanks for watching. Atlanta Motor Speedway is celebrating 6 decades of incredible moments like the 1992 championship race during its next race weekend on March 13th through the 15th in 2020. Since 1960, AMS has hosted some of the most memorable moments in NASCAR history. And with the Speedway's 20 in 20 initiative to make 20 individual improvements for fans, Atlanta Motor Speedway's 60th anniversary weekend is gearing up to be its best one yet. That's why this coming spring is going to be a perfect time to experience NASCAR at a track that's been a favorite among fans and drivers alike. Tickets for the 2020 Cup race start at just $39. And if you mention this video when you call Atlanta Motor Speedway's ticket office, you can get an exclusive offer to make your NASCAR trip even better. Head to atlantamotorspeedway.com or call 877-9AMS-TICKS and mention Slapshoes to get your 2020 tickets today. So until next time, y'all take it easy, and I'll see you at Atlanta Motor Speedway.